Stanford University.
Hello. Hello. In this video for E145 Technology Entrepreneurship, I'd like to offer some summary of what I think are the most important points from the course and some final career advice for all of you. So many of you might be asking, after this course is over, what are the next steps that I should take? If you're a student here at Stanford, there are a number of other courses on entrepreneurship that you might look into. These include Tina Seelig's class on creativity and improvisation, the boardroom class that Clint Corver teaches, Global Entrepreneurial Marketing by Tom Kosnick. If you're going to become a master's student, then you have a number of other options open to you. Technology Venture Formation, 273, or also E245, the Lean Launchpad with Steve Blank. The online students can also take the Lean Launchpad class with Steve Blank, where he goes into much more detail on customer development and the Lean startup process. There are also a number of incubator programs that you might think about applying to. Many of these have expressed interest in getting students from E145 to apply to the program. So these could include Y Combinator, AngelPad, Techstars, the Highland Summer Program, so on and so forth. There's also the Mayfield Fellows Program for the Stanford students. So this is a highly selective program, but it goes over 3 quarters with a startup internship in the summer, and is a really great way to get a wonderful network here in Silicon Valley and with other Stanford alumni. There's also a number of student groups and activities you can get involved with. BASES, the StartX incubator program, getting involved with Coaches on Call. There are many other resources that I'm happy to connect you with here at Stanford as you think about the next steps in your entrepreneurial education and also with your startup ventures. Your final assignment for the class, which I'd like for both the Stanford students and the online students to do and then upload somewhere where we can all see if you're comfortable sharing them, is to write your own personal business plan. So you can think of this as kind of the business plan for your career, and we can apply many of the same aspects that we've been thinking about to this. So this is going to be 15% of your grade for the Stanford students. So you want to have one section for the vision or the opportunity. You want to think about what are your goals after you leave Stanford? What are your values? What's your mission going to be? You might list 3 key questions that might guide your choices. Or think about what you love, what you fear. There are a number of ways that you could structure this section to think about what opportunity are you pursuing, or what's the vision over the course of the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years of your career. Or if you can't look that far ahead, just look ahead the next 1 to 2 to 3 years. You can also think about your market or your implementation strategy, your commercialization strategy, so to speak. So you can think about your market positioning statement. This might be a hypothetical employer, an industry that you want to get into, a particular organization, or somewhere in the world that you want to move to. What compelling value do you offer, either to employees or to society at large? And how are you going to differentiate yourself from other Stanford students? What are your key strengths or weaknesses? On the topic of weaknesses, you might think about risks and how you might mitigate those risks. Is there a certain set of milestones or checkpoints that you want to lay out in your future? And how will you measure or determine if you've met those milestones? Are there some external factors that might come into play that you might think about mitigating those sources of risk? Or is there an additional piece to your education that you want to fill in next? You can also think about your personal board of directors. Is there a set of mentors and advisors who are really important to you? Perhaps think of 3 key people who you would want to get to advise or mentor you over this next stage of your career. They might be dead or alive, world or family leaders, friends or strangers, but I would encourage you to pick people who you might actually reach out to and who might actually serve as a mentor to you in your career over this next stage. So please send this to the course assistants and myself, and please also send us your proposed equity split in terms of the group projects for the class. So if you feel that you've pulled most of the weight in your venture, or you feel that you have a teammate who's pulled a lot of weight, think about how you would split the equity in terms of percentages across your teammates, and please send that to us as well. So some final career advice. I'd encourage you to think very carefully about how you invest your time, your energy, and your talent over the next few years, especially at the beginning of your career. This is extremely crucial. So you might want to think about each career move. Is this a bond, a stock, an option? Working for a large company might look more like a bond, where it's kind of steady and stable, versus joining a startup might be more like an equity or an option. But I think how you should really think about this is try to maximize your learning early on in your career. Even if this particular venture or this particular organization doesn't work well, you want to maximize how much you're learning early on so that you can take advantage of that later on. That doesn't necessarily mean furthering your formal education, but when you're thinking about joining a work team, a startup or a large company, is this a set of people that I want to add to my network? And is this a set of people who I'm really excited about learning from? And don't be afraid to take calculated risks early. It's much easier to try out something risky and fail early on in your career than later. And so often some of the opportunities where you can learn the most often appear to be the riskiest in the beginning. And so we've talked a bit about entrepreneurial thinking during this course, and I think one key aspect of entrepreneurial thinking is coming to see problems as potential sources of opportunity, and the bigger the problem, the bigger the opportunity. We've also talked some about the balancing point of determination and flexibility, of being the importance of being interdisciplinary, of thinking of solving problems, and that involves, to some extent, being flexible and changing direction, but also, to a certain extent, requires persistence and determination of a certain goal that you have in mind. I'd encourage you to follow your bliss, as they say, blaze your own path. There's a great video called The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell that I think is a great template for thinking about this. But it's much easier to learn a lot and do a lot of work when this is something that you really feel passionately about and you feel is your cause. And finally, remember that there are no limits to what you can do. Many of our limits, as we talked about in the brainstorming session, are self-imposed. So don't be afraid to set goals that are extremely ambitious, extremely lofty. Go after big problems. The world needs bright, ambitious people who are going after the most important problems in society. A quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, also remember that life is about the journey, not just about some destination or some endpoint that you want to get to. So try and enjoy the journey along the way as well, even though there are going to be difficult points and hard points to get through. And so in my own path, I think a large part of it started out from this study abroad experience that I had in India, where I stayed with a village family that was having severe drought and was down to eating just one meal per day. This inspired me to go back to Duke and find a technology for drought-resistant corn which could help solve this problem. And that's what got me started initially in entrepreneurship. And so now that I've gone through that experience and a few other startups, I really want to try and teach you as future entrepreneurs and help improve your chances of success. And so hopefully I have imparted through this course some of my experience and some of the frameworks and ways that you can think about entrepreneurship that will enable you all to become more successful in your ventures. And that's what really excites me. If I can have an impact on at least some of you of increasing your chances of success, you might then go on and teach other people those things, and then the network effects would just expand beyond that. We can see this kind of thing in the case of Silicon Valley, how one startup then led to spin-offs that created the next set of firms in Silicon Valley and created the next set of semiconductor companies. And many of these can be traced back to the success of Fairchild Semiconductor. And clearly the networks have become important, so I'd encourage you to keep in touch with your classmates, keep in touch with me, and hopefully we can help one another, not just in this class, but going forward as well.
This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why did I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever, because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart even when it leads you off the well-worn path, and that will make all the difference. Medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. Is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choice. Remembering that I'll be dead soon, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to... My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, if you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right. It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. I lived with that diagnosis all day. Later that evening, I had a biopsy where they stuck an endoscope down my throat, through my stomach and into my intestines, put a needle into my pancreas and got a few cells from the tumor. I was sedated, but my wife, who was there, told me that when they viewed the cells under a microscope, the doctors started crying because it turned out to be a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that is curable with surgery. I had the surgery, and thankfully, I'm fine now. This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. Having lived through it, I can now say this to you with a bit more certainty than when death was a useful but purely intellectual concept. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stuart Brand, not far from here in Menlo Park, and he brought it to life with his poetic touch. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing, so it was all made with typewriters, scissors, and Polaroid cameras. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic, overflowing with neat tools and great notions. Stuart and his team put out several issues of the Whole Earth Catalog, and then, when it had run its course, they put out a final issue. It was the mid-1970s, and I was your age. On the back cover of their final issue was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself. And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
So stay hungry, stay foolish. And I think the other key line in that speech was your time is limited. Don't waste it living someone else's life. If there are only two things that you remember from this class, I think you can't do much better than those two. So the final thing I'd like you all to do is to take a moment with your group and think about what you've learned in the class and what you might want to remember and convey to the other students. So we'll be talking about this a bit more in class. And so the final 3 points that I want to leave you with to kind of summarize what we've talked about in class are, first of all, try to develop a mindset of turning big problems into big opportunities. Second, the entrepreneurial process is a continuous process of developing a hypothesis, testing it, and then iterating. And so it's a process of experimentation. But it's not mindless experimentation. It's got to be experimentation with something in mind that you want to learn. And that's why it's important to think about what hypothesis you're testing. So experiment, but experiment with learning in mind. And then finally, do steps 1 and 2 with great people. Life is too short, and if you work with great people, it will also tend to open up other opportunities for you subsequently, regardless of whether this particular venture or this particular company works out. Try and work with people who you'd want to remain as lifetime connections. Lastly, you might think about what you've learned in this class about your entrepreneurship style. Are you the type that's really suited to go out and start a brand new company from scratch? Or are you better off thinking entrepreneurially within a large company, which is something that the world certainly needs as well? Perhaps your entrepreneurship style is in a certain sector or is in academia. You want to think a little bit about what you've learned from the class and what you've experienced and what that might shed light on in terms of your entrepreneurship style. So that's it. I'll leave you with these 3 main points that essentially encapsulate the class. I hope you all have enjoyed this. I've really had a great thrill teaching you all, and I look forward to seeing what you all can do. Thank you very much. And so finally, for the Stanford students, you'll be making your final presentations in class, and for the online students, you'll be recording your presentations and uploading them somewhere on the web, and just like we did previously, posting them onto the forum, watch each other's presentations, vote up the better ones, and I'm excited to see what you all have been able to do during the course of the class.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.